Hey guys, so today's video is going to be on how to keep and breed crickets. I already did a video on this a couple of weeks ago, but since that video I've learned a lot about how you can get the most success out of keeping and breeding them. So I'm going to just do a complete remake of that video, but also include some new things that I've learned since that video that I found to be really helpful for maximum success when breeding and keeping the crickets. So before I get started with explaining how I like to keep and breed my crickets, I just want to let you guys know that I'm planning to do a giveaway for an INKBIRD ITC 308 thermostat the first Friday of November 2022. I already explained most of the details last week, but I will explain them again just to make sure that you didn't miss them, or if you're a new subscriber, you know what they are. So, basically what I'm going to be doing is, if I can get more than 50 new subscribers to my YouTube channel by the first Friday in October 2022, then I'll actually do the giveaway. I already have one new subscriber, so only 49 to go. But after I get those new subscribers, I will, my video the first Friday in October, I'll explain some more of the rules. But basically what will happen is I'll have a post up on my Facebook page at that time, and basically all you'll have to do is comment on that post as well as join the INKBIRD fan club on Facebook, and you will be in the running to win this thermostat. Like I said, I'll put more details in the video the first Friday in October, but I'll put the link to the INKBIRD fan club both in the description of this video and the description of that video, and in the post I put on my Facebook page, and I will put my Facebook page link to in the description to this video, as well as the description for the video I will be doing the first Friday in October. But so all you have to do at that point is comment on my post and join the INKBIRD fan club, and you will be in the running to win the INKBIRD ITC 308 thermostat shipped right to your door. So now, without further ado, let's get back to today's video. So this is a cricket enclosure that I have. This is just a typical enclosure. It can house a hatchling. It can house hatchlings or adults. It doesn't matter the size. The only thing that differs with size is the amount of crickets that you can keep in the same sized space, but that's kind of self-explanatory. So the first thing I have in this enclosure is the vermiculite. Vermiculite is the preferred substrate for crickets because it absorbs both odors and moisture. Moisture is one of the key factors that will start mold growth and other fungus growth. And of course, mold and fungus is not helpful to any sort of cricket breeding colony. So vermiculite is really great for keeping that down, as well as it also helps keep bacteria down, because bacteria needs bacteria needs moisture to multiply. So there's not as much bacteria in here as there could be if it was a moist environment. Crickets actually like it rather dry, so vermiculite really helps with that, because vermiculite will absorb the moisture in the air, and then there will only be dry air left, and the crickets will live the way that they want to live, and the way that they're most healthy living. But, so vermiculite is one of the best options for substrates, like I said, but there are a couple other options, including shredded paper bedding used for small animals, and paper towel bedding, and no bedding at all. I recommend vermiculite, as do most cricket breeders, because it, like I said, it helps absorb both odors and moisture, but other substrates can be used if you need them. But if you don't use vermiculite, you need to clean the enclosure a lot more frequently, as the cricket's feces will just land on the floor or other substrates, and where vermiculite will dry out the feces and make them so that they're not nearly as detrimental to the crickets if they accumulate. Other substrates won't do that, and so the wet feces can eventually start to mold and rot, and then you have not only feces all over the place, but you also have mold problems and rotting problems, and therefore you also have bacteria problems, which doesn't make for a healthy breeding environment. So vermiculite is one of the best options for substrate. You can use other options, but you have to clean the enclosure a lot more often. The next thing that I have in here are the egg flats. Egg flats are a pretty typical thing to have in both cricket and dubia roach breeding colonies, as well as actually most feeder insects, now that I think about it. So as you can see, the crickets tend to congregate inside the egg flats, which really helps because if I ever want to move the crickets into a different enclosure, I can just take the entire egg flat out of the enclosure, transfer it to the other enclosure, and then tap it against the side of the enclosure, and all of the crickets, or most of them at least, will fall out. So as you can see, there are a couple of crickets left, which if I shift the way I'm holding it, they'll also fall out. So now there are no more crickets left in this egg flat. So it's really easy to transfer the crickets in and out of the egg flats, because when I put it in here, after a few minutes, they'll tend to go towards the egg flat and try to congregate in there, and then I will, after a while, be able to transfer them if I need to. So that's part of the reason why egg flats are so great. Another reason is because it's so dark inside of the egg flats when they're upside down that the crickets like to congregate in there during the day because they're nocturnal, so they only like the dark. So they'll sleep in there during the day, and then they'll come out at night when it's dark out, and that's when they'll feed and mate and lay eggs. As you can see, they're still somewhat active during the day, especially when they're disturbed, but they're mostly active at night, and that's when you will generally hear them chirping. Currently, if you listen carefully, you can hear one cricket chirping. I'm not sure if you can hear it, but I can hear it at least. And that was actually an escapee from one of my breeder colonies. I don't have any crickets in my breeder colonies right now chirping, and that's because it's in the middle of the day and they don't really chirp during the day. So the egg flats really help the crickets to have a hiding spot, and as you can see, what did I tell you? There's already 6 crickets in the egg flats, even though I just made sure that all of them were out of the egg flats just a minute ago. So egg flats are something that's really, really helpful to have in a cricket enclosure. In fact, egg flats or some other non-toxic cardboard hideout is essential for successful keeping and breeding of crickets, at least if you want to have a lot of success. You might still be able to get some success with no hiding spaces, but you'll stress the crickets like crazy, and when they're stressed, they tend to be less prolific breeders, and they tend to have less long lifespans. This is the minimum number of hideouts, cardboard hideouts, that I recommend for a cricket enclosure. You can have more, you can have less. I recommend this is the minimum. I would love to have more of them in here. I haven't had a chance to order any off of eBay recently, and I don't have enough from actual egg cartons to put a ton in all of my enclosures. I recommend putting a lot more than I have in here, and I will do that as soon as I can, but this is the minimum that you can have in an enclosure and still have healthy, happy crickets. And of course, the amount of egg flats you have does depend quite a bit on the number of crickets you have, because part of the reason you want the egg flats is to increase surface area inside your enclosures, and the more surface area you have, the more crickets you can house in a smaller space. So it's actually kind of counterproductive space in order to try to conserve space if you have less egg crates, or egg flats rather, in the enclosure. As far as heating goes, heating and lighting, I don't have any lights on there for the sake of having lights. I do have this Exoterra night glow bulb, and it doesn't really seem like, I'll turn off the light real quick, it doesn't really seem like it's purple in the camera, but it is actually purple. It's designed to give keepers a chance to view their reptiles at night, as well as giving their reptiles some heat in a kind of non-threatening way. Since the black purple light kind of simulates moonlight, it doesn't stress the animal as much as red light would. At least that's the theory. But what I like to use them for is to heat the cricket enclosures. I have, I think, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I have 7 of them going right now. And they're all the same, they're on the same thermostat, and they're all the same wattage. They're 50-watt bulbs, and they're all just going until the thermostat tells them that they can't, and then they stop. And it's very important to have the same wattage and type of bulbs when you're heating a cricket's enclosure, because otherwise, as long as you have them on the same thermostat, you have different wattages if you have different thermostats for each enclosure. But if you have them all on the same thermostat, you want to have the same wattage and type of bulb, because otherwise they can give off different levels of heat, and you want to make sure that your cricket's enclosures are staying at about 80 to 90 degrees, preferably somewhere in between there. You can keep them down to like 74 without any detrimental effects in the long run, but I don't think they will breed below 74. For best production and quickest growth, I like to keep them at around 84 to 86. 86, I don't like to keep them like at 86, because generally the fluctuations will keep them closer to 90, and I don't want to overheat my cricket colony, so I try for 84 to 86. And of course you have a relatively wide range, so it's not that big of a deal if you go to one side or the other side above 84 or 86. So as far as escape-proofing the enclosures goes, the hatchling crickets are actually very adept climbers. They're able to climb even plastic surfaces such as this enclosure. So I have to be really careful about that. So what I do to make sure that they can't escape is I will line the inside of the enclosure with packing tape. So I'll just go along the inside of the enclosure with the packing tape 1 or 2 times, and that will escape-proof the enclosure sufficiently to prevent most of the escapes I would otherwise get from the pinheads. Most of the adults can't really climb on the glass or the plastic rather, and they don't escape that often when I have the lid on. So it's not really that big of a deal when I have adults, but for the babies, they are very, very good at escaping. So that is, okay, yeah, I forgot. As far as food and water goes, so crickets are notorious for drowning very, very quickly in water, and pinheads especially can drown in even a drop of water. So how can you give them water, especially the pinheads, without risking the cricket's life? So what I do, and what most people do, is I give them cricket water, or cricket gel. So this is water stored in crystals. They sell them commercially for plant use as well as for cricket use. Basically, you treat however much water with Reptisafe, and that's very important because crickets are very, very susceptible to chlorine and other heavy metals. And then you soak the the crystals in the water for about 12 hours, and then by the end of that time, they look similar. They look basically exactly like this. And this is a damp, wet crystal. It's kind of easy to break. And basically what the crickets do is they will eat the crystal, and since there's moisture in the crystal, they'll therefore be consuming the moisture, and they will not have any issues with dehydration. So those are really, really useful because I've never had a single pinhead cricket drown in one of those, or any cricket for that matter, and it's relatively inexpensive. I got a container of them that can make about 24 gallons, I think it is, of cricket gel, and that was only $16 on Amazon. So it's relatively cheap, and it does its job really well. So this is what I recommend for water for the crickets. And as you can see, I actually already have a cricket in there that's beginning to drink the water, so that's pretty cool. I'm not sure if you can see it actually. See if I can turn off the... Nope, that's not working. Okay, yeah, it's kind of hard to see, but there's a cricket right there who's already eating the water gel that I just put in there. So that's pretty cool. They recognize it as a water source, and they do drink from it. As far as food goes, you can feed crickets most fruits and vegetables as long as they have been washed to remove any pesticides or insects that may contain parasites from them. I like to feed my crickets wild collected dandelion leaves, and here's why. So, according to the one article that I read online, actually several articles that I've read online, reptiles cannot get parasites that will stay inside the reptile and like actually be parasites to the reptile from their feeder insects unless the feeder insects have come into contact with a reptile that has those parasites. So when I feed the crickets dandelion leaves from outside, after I've washed them, they won't have any parasites that other reptiles have left behind, and the crickets won't be able to, the only parasites the crickets will be able to get won't be passed on to the reptile. So it's actually safe to collect leaves from outdoors to feed to the crickets as long as you wash them to make sure that they don't have any parasites on them that may transfer to the reptile, or any sorts of pesticides that may either kill the crickets or else at the very least weaken them, and then the pesticides will pass on to the reptile and after a while accumulate and cause diseases in the reptile. So you definitely got to be careful of those, but I find that feeding the reptiles, or feeding the crickets rather, dandelion leaves collected from outdoors after they've been washed hasn't been an issue for me. That said, you definitely want to make sure that you're not using any pesticides and that your neighbors aren't using any pesticides, because pesticides can travel very, very quickly through the water systems and whatever, and although they may not harm us or even your reptile immediately, for something as small as a cricket, they'll harm them very, very quickly, and even if it doesn't kill your cricket, it'll pass on to the reptiles, and after a while will accumulate and kill the reptiles. And don't think that just because you haven't been using pesticides this year, it isn't an issue. If anybody has been using pesticides at all within the past several years, it can still pass on to it'll still pass on to the dandelions and then to your crickets. So that's something you really have to be careful of, because pesticides are one of the biggest dangers for cricket breeding as well as reptile keeping. So aside from that, like I said, you can feed them commercially grown food, but I recommend that you stay with organic stuff in that case, because the pesticides that the farms use are basically industrialized versions of the pesticides that you would use. So industrialized means that they have industrial level strength. So even though the pesticides that you use the only traces of them may not kill excuse me may not kill the cricket immediately, the industrialized versions may very well do that. So you just got to be really careful, especially with the industrialized versions of the pesticides that farmers will use. So as far as cleaning goes, so what I like to do is every now and then when the crickets are about this size, and I've already done it for these guys, so they're not due for another couple of months, but the first time I do it is when they're about this size. I will transfer all of the crickets into a smaller enclosure, put that enclosure into the refrigerator, and the crickets will actually slow down like crazy with the lower temperatures. And while they're slowing down, I will remove everything from the enclosure and clean the enclosure using a 10% bleach solution, and then I will rinse it out really well, of course, so that it doesn't smell of bleach. Dry it, and then put fresh vermiculite and fresh cardboard in here, and throw away the old vermiculite and old cardboard. That will reduce a lot of the whatever fungus and bacteria that have grown in the enclosure, and dispose of the feces. And so that's definitely a very necessary part of caring for crickets. So that is really the only thing you need to do to clean a cricket's enclosure, except for if they're not eating all of their food, it's helpful to remove the food, I've found. The food otherwise just accumulates, and it's just a breeding spot for bacteria, and the crickets will eat them if they're starving after they've dried out, but generally they like the moistened, easier to eat dandelion leaves more than the dried out, crunchy ones. So that's really the only thing you need to do to clean the enclosure. It's not really that difficult, and it's actually kind of simple. But yeah, that's really the only thing you need to do to clean it. So in a moment here, I'm just going to move on to the enclosures for the adult crickets that are breeding. But before I do that, I just want to show you guys, this is the effects of using cricket water that does not have chlorine in it, and not allowing any crickets to escape. In the colony I last showed you, the crickets had been, in the first part of their lives, had been being fed cricket water that had chlorine in it, and it was devastating. I lost so many baby crickets, and now look at this thing. So many, and these ones aren't even nearly as large as the ones that I already showed you. Probably triple or quadruple the amount that I had in the other enclosure. The numbers are crazy. And I think this is basically all because I started A, cleaning the enclosure more often, and B, I started feeding the crickets water that did not have chlorine in it. And I think the chlorine was the biggest part of it, because I had not been letting the enclosure get super dirty beforehand. And I will actually right now show you, for contrast, an enclosure that has that was being fed. This is from the same time period. It had been being fed water that had chlorine in it, and this is the same amount of clutches, same amount of adults, everything. And there's still a lot of crickets in here. Makes it worth keeping, but not nearly as many as there could have been had I been more careful with chlorine. So this is an enclosure for some adult crickets that are breeding. So this is the probe for the thermostat. I only need it in one of the enclosures because they're all going to be heated to roughly the same temperature, because they're all basically the same system. They have the same light bulbs, everything. But the really only difference in this enclosure, other than the age of the crickets, is the inclusion of this. This is a lay box, and it has coconut fiber in it, which keeps moisture relatively well, and so the crickets will lay their eggs in it, and their eggs will be able to incubate in here once I put it into the incubator, and after a while the eggs will hatch into baby pinhead crickets. Generally, the adults are only good for a couple weeks, I found, and then production starts to slow. But I think that's mostly because I buy my crickets as extra larges at the pet store, and by that point they're already so large, they probably have already used most of their reproductive life just living, not actually even being bred. It doesn't look like there's any eggs in here yet, but after a while there should be some more. But if I can find some eggs, actually I will show you one of the enclosures in the incubator, because that definitely has eggs in it. But they basically look like miniature grains of rice, and the pinheads hatch. The pinheads are exactly as big as the eggs are. But really that's the only difference from the rest of the crickets enclosures that the adults have. It's basically, in order to get the lay box, I just mix coconut fiber with water, squeeze out the excess water, and spread the coconut fiber inside a Tupperware container, and I have a lay box. It's really honestly kind of simple. What you can do to decrease adults feeding on the eggs is you can also you can add a wire mesh over the lay box with holes that are large enough so that the cricket's ovipositor can get through the holes in the screen, but the crickets can't get through to feed on the eggs. I don't do this because I haven't had much of an issue with that, but it's definitely something that some people have had an issue with, and something that you might want to be careful with. Last but not least, this is my incubator. I already took the top off of it because I'm going to show the video, but I just want to let you guys know that there is a top for it. Otherwise, there would not be any way to keep in heat, and it would just be heating the entire basement. So right now it's at 87.1 degrees. I have it set for 88 degrees. You can have it set up to like 90 degrees, but I don't want it to go much higher than that because I don't want them to accidentally harm my cricket eggs. In this enclosure here, let me see if I can find... Okay, yep. All of those... I'm going to turn off the light so that you can see a little better. All of those little grains of rice in there are cricket eggs. And hopefully, in a couple of days here, they will hatch into baby crickets. What I found is at 90 degrees, the eggs take about 10 to 11 days to hatch. And of course, at anything lower than that, it'll take much longer. You can incubate them at as low as 80 degrees, but that'll take closer to a month to hatch. In this enclosure, I currently have a bunch of crickets that are hatching. As you can see on the sides, there are a couple crickets that actually drowned in the condensation on the side of the enclosure. But if I open the enclosure, you can probably still see a couple healthy crickets hopping around in there. So yeah, there are a couple healthy crickets in there that you can see. As you can see, they're extremely small and definitely not anything that you could feed to any leopard gecko or many other species of reptiles that feed on crickets. I mean, there are some smaller geckos that you can feed them to, but not many. But so yeah, that's basically how the incubator is set up. It's just a simple incubator. I did a video on how I made this incubator, which I will put a link to that video in the description below. But it's just a very simple incubator. It cost me about $50 to make after I already had most of the supplies, so left over from the other incubator that I had, so there's that. But maybe it'll cost you around, I don't know, if you don't have any of the supplies, maybe around $100 to $120, I don't know. It's not that expensive, and it does its job really, really well. So, anyway, so those are the things that I like to do to make sure that my crickets are doing really well, and that's how I keep and breed them. There are other ways you can use, but that's the most successful one that I'm aware of that is the least labor intensive. And honestly, it's definitely trial and error. I learned a lot in the last couple of weeks that I didn't know before, specifically the chlorine issue. I didn't realize how much of an issue that was until I started feeding my my crickets, water that did not have chlorine in it, and it just made a world of difference, and I realized how big of a deal it really was. So, anyway, that is how I take care of and breed my crickets.